The only VPN to prove multiple times in court that they have no record of your internet activity is private internet access. Each time the judge said, show us the person's internet activity, and private internet access said, sorry, we don't have it. Their systems are also regularly audited by Deloitte to verify the no-log policy. And it's the only VPN with open source code, so the whole world can see that nothing is being logged. Private internet access is giving my audience 83% off, which is just $203 a month plus 4 extra months for free. Go to piavpn.com/DavidP. The link is down below. Welcome, everybody. Let's start today with everyone's favorite subject, tariffs. Not normally the most titillating topic, but it is one of the few topics that even approximates policy that Donald Trump is willing to talk about. I'm going to play a very interesting video for you of Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, saying he's not a fan of Trump's tariff proposal. Now, when it comes to policy, Trump will mostly only talk about mass militarized deportations of migrants and putting tariffs on China. Trump has said he'll put a 10 to 20% blanket tariff on Chinese goods. Trump has offhandedly said earlier this week he'll put a 200% tariff on John Deere products if John Deere does indeed move any production to Mexico. Trump's economic tool is tariffs. Tariffs are going to solve the national deficit. Tariffs are going to solve how we pay for childcare. It's always tariffs. Trump has one hammer. It's called tariffs. Everything looks like a nail. So here is Mitch McConnell asked, what do you think about this Trump tariff plan?
Former President Trump has proposed a 200% tariff on John Deere tractors if they're made in Mexico. Are you concerned that some of these tariff proposals by the GOP nominee could drive up costs for consumers or hurt urban exporters in Kentucky, for example?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of tariffs. They raise the prices for American consumers. I'm more of a free trade kind of Republican that remembers how many jobs are created by the exports that we engage in. So I'm not a tariff fan.
So listen, many of you have written to me, many of you with tears in your eyes as you type, just sobbing, saying, Sir David, can you explain when using tariffs as an economic tool would be useful? Rarely is there a tool that's just always bad. If it's not a good idea to implement tariffs the way Donald Trump plans to implement them, when would tariffs be okay and wouldn't just cause inflation? And I think that this is an excellent question. Whether or not tariffs raise domestic prices depends on a number of factors. How competitive is the industry? How available are substitutes? And what are the broader market dynamics? So, for example, if the country imposing the tariff, the United States in this example, doesn't produce enough of the good being tariffed domestically or doesn't produce it at the same quality, consumers will probably keep relying on the imported good, paying the tariff, which will make it more expensive domestically. So imagine you get most of your electronics from Thailand, and then all of a sudden there's a tariff on Thai electronics. If the American-made electronics are of lower quality, or you just don't make electronics domestically, consumers will just keep getting the Thai electronics, paying the tariff, and it will be inflationary, the fact that you put in that tariff. Another example, lack of substitutes. If there are few or no alternative sources of the good, either domestically or from some other country, the price is going to increase domestically as a result of the tariff. So imagine some unique foreign luxury product. If you put a tariff on that and domestic producers can't offer an alternative, consumers are just going to face higher prices. It will be inflationary. There's a bunch of other factors. What sort of market power does the importer have? What sort of market power does the exporter have? Are there supply chain disruptions that are particular to, this is more when you're using component parts, like if you put a tariff on auto parts from China for American assembled vehicles, that can cause a supply chain disruption and make the vehicles more expensive in the United States. That's something we saw during COVID, for example. So when can you use tariffs without raising prices domestically? Well, it's the opposite of all of these scenarios. If there's plenty of domestic options for getting a particular good, you can often safely tariff imports of that very same product. When there are substitute products available, it's not necessarily that the U.S. makes the same good, but it's that the U.S. or third countries have a substitute that's feasible. You know, there's, I don't know, what's a good example of this? You put, my sumo oranges, my beloved sumo oranges, you put a tariff on Chinese sumos, but all of a sudden Chile is making sumos. I think they are, actually. So, hey, you know what? We can go and get the sumos from Chile instead of China. We're hurting China economically, but consumers in the U.S. aren't paying higher prices. So there are these situations in which you can do it. Trump's tariffs on China will increase prices. Many consumer goods are heavily sourced from China. Domestic alternatives aren't readily available. As I've said, we can re-engineer our entire manufacturing chain, but that would take years. In the short term, even in the medium term, it would be quite inflationary. Many products from China are low cost. The substitutes will be more expensive or less available when we have them. That'll drive up costs. Increased production costs, because companies that rely on Chinese components or materials will have to pay more for the components. They will just pass that on by charging more for the finished product. And then finally, foreign producers may not absorb the cost. Trump has the idea, if you put a 10% tariff on China, China will just cut the cost 10% to account for that. Very often that does not happen. And if you look historically at examples, it very often doesn't happen. And so when you look at the tool tariff, yes, there are times you can narrowly use tariffs in certain situations, on certain goods or on certain materials without causing domestic inflation. Trump's 10 to 20% on Chinese stuff is very much the opposite. Mitch McConnell happens to be right on this. By the way, bonus clip from this press conference that Mitch McConnell did, he was asked, is this entire Mark Robinson thing in North Carolina a bad idea? And here's what Mitch McConnell had to say.
As a leader of your party, would you recommend that Republicans abandon the North Carolina gubernatorial candidate Mark Robinson over his lewd and graphic posts on a porn website?
Well, it won't surprise you to know that I'm happy that there's not a Senate race in North Carolina.
All right. So Mitch McConnell acknowledging the long odds now facing Mark Robinson after being caught declaring himself a black Nazi who would like to own some slaves if slavery came back, who admitted to peeping in girls' locker room showers, and who said that he's into transgender pornography despite public statements denouncing the trans community. Mitch saying, that's not good. It is not good. Joe Biden did something yesterday that Donald Trump could never do, would never do, which is that Joe Biden admitted it is no longer time for me to be the leader. It is time for it to be someone else because I love my country more than I love my party or being president. Maybe not even more than he loves his party, because arguably what he's doing by stepping aside and allowing Kamala Harris is actually good for the Democratic Party as well. Biden speaking at the United Nations. Take a listen.
I made the preservation of democracy the central cause of my presidency. This summer, I faced a decision whether to seek a second term as president. It was a difficult decision. Being president has been the honor of my life. There's so much more I want to get done. As much as I love the job, I love my country more. I decided after 50 years of public service, it's time for a new generation of leadership to take my nation forward. My fellow leaders, let us never forget, some things are more important than staying in power. It's your people.
Notice the applause. We'll come back to that. Some things are more important than staying in power. Imagine delivering that message to Vladimir Putin or even to Donald Trump himself. Can you imagine Trump ever saying, hey, you know what? It's time for the next generation. I'm not the best person for the job anymore going forward over the next 4 years. Trump would never say something like that because Trump's belief is that he knows more than everyone and he's better equipped than anyone to be president of the United States. Humility. Can you imagine? Joe Biden also addressing, and I'm glad he did, the decision to pull out of Afghanistan.
We need to end the era of war that began on 9/11. As Vice President to President Obama, he asked me to work to wind down the military operations in Iraq, and we did, painful as it was. When I came to office as president, Afghanistan had replaced Vietnam as America's longest war. I was determined to end it, and I did. It was a hard decision, but the right decision. 4 American presidents had faced that decision, but I was determined not to leave it to the 5th. It was a decision accompanied by tragedy. 13 brave Americans lost their lives, along with hundreds of Afghans in a suicide bomb. I think those lost lives, I think them every day. I think of all the 2,461 U.S. military deaths over a long 20 years of that war. 20,744 American servicemen wounded in action. I think of their service, their sacrifice, and their heroism. I know other countries lost their own men and women fighting alongside us. We honor their sacrifices as well.
Acknowledging there was tragedy in getting out, but that it had to be done. And when you consider the fact that we were losing troops, coalition troops in Afghanistan over the last 20 years, doesn't diminish the tragedy of those lives that were lost getting out, but it does put a stop to it. Now, for contrast, I do want to remind you what happened when Donald Trump spoke to the United Nations in 2018. Not quiet respect and applause, which is what Joe Biden got yesterday from the international community, but audible laughter. Remember this moment, globally humiliating for Donald Trump?
Madam President, Mr. Secretary General, world leaders, ambassadors, and distinguished delegates. 1 year ago, I stood before you for the first time in this grand hall. I addressed the threats facing our world, and I presented a vision to achieve a brighter future for all of humanity. Today, I stand before the United Nations General Assembly to share the extraordinary progress we've made. In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true.
Audible laughter.
Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
Well, it's because you were a joke on the global stage, sir. You know, my instinct is that it's always difficult to know, as a presidency comes to an end, how it will be looked at in the future. When we look back, how will it be seen? That being said, we're getting a sense of the joke that the Trump presidency was, as we now get further from it and hopefully don't go back to it. And my guess is, and maybe it's wishful thinking because we know that he did so many things right and just seems to be a good guy. Doesn't mean he did everything perfectly. My sense is Joe Biden will be seen as an exemplary leader of the United States further down the line. You never know until some time's gone by, but it seems like that would be correct. And Biden showing the humility Trump is constitutionally unable to show. Let me know what you think. Make sure you're subscribed to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/The David Pakman Show. We'll be with you for whatever comes next after November. You watch YouTube, you listen to podcasts, you've heard a ton of ads for VPNs, but all VPNs are pretty much the same except for one. Our sponsor, Private Internet Access, is the only VPN that can confirm your internet activity is not being logged. Their software is fully open source, so you can see that traffic isn't being logged. Their systems are also independently audited by the Big Four accounting firm Deloitte to confirm nothing is being logged, and they've demonstrated multiple times in court they have no record of user activity. Everyone should use a VPN when they connect to the internet. Hides your IP address so governments and big tech can't track you, and you can access Netflix and Hulu content not normally available in your home country. Private Internet Access has servers in 91 different countries and all 50 US states. You can protect all of your devices with just a single account, and Private Internet Access is giving my audience 83% off. Comes out to just $203 a month plus 4 extra months for free. Go to piavpn.com/DavidP. The link is in the description. The David Pakman Show, as it has for so long, primarily depends on your support to do what we do. In an era of hidden and secret Russian influencer money and massive dumps of corporate cash that go undisclosed and all of these different things, we have a few advertisers. We have some money that comes in from the various revenue share programs like on YouTube. And then beyond that, we're primarily supported by people who listen to the podcast, watch YouTube clips, watch on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and say, hey, you know what? I like this enough to sign up. If you have a cable subscription in the United States, even without knowing it, even without wanting to, you're sending Fox News $3 a month. Well, with the coupon code MUTETRUMP, you can send us $3 a month instead or in addition to. You can learn more at joinpakman.com. I encourage you to do so and get the full experience. Get the commercial-free show. Get it daily. Get it earlier than we make it publicly available to everybody else. Consider it at joinpakman.com. All right, let's do a little critical thinking and media literacy. There is a headline taking the internets by storm about early voting and the share of early voters that are supporting Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. I want to tell you my thought process when I saw the headline, and there's a lot here that's important to discuss. So yesterday, headlines like the following started being reported. Half of voters plan to vote early with a huge partisan split. Okay, that's interesting. Let's see what it says. NBC News polling shows that 51% of registered voters say they plan to vote early, with that group breaking hard for Harris. And on the other hand, election day voters are backing Trump. As we read down into the article, we get more specific data. And what the polling found is that about half of those registered voters say, I am going to vote early, either by mail or in person. And among that group, Kamala Harris is winning 61-35. That's a big margin, a 26-point margin. My immediate questions when I see this polling, because there were a lot of people gleefully reporting this, it's over, we've got it, Trump's done. My questions were, number one, okay, this year it appears as though Kamala Harris will lead early voting 61-35. What share of the early vote did Joe Biden get in 2020? Because while a 26-point lead sounds awesome, it would be relevant to know, given that election day voters will be voting overwhelmingly for Trump, what sort of lead did Biden have among early voters in 2020? That's question number one. And question number two, what portion of those who say they will be voting early will actually do it? It's perfectly reasonable that many people would plan to vote early, want to vote early, desire early voting, and then life gets in the way, and next thing you know, it's November 5th, and they end up actually voting on Election Day. We're not going to know the answer to that second question until later, but I went back and looked. how did early voting in 2020 favor Joe Biden, or did it? And when you look at that data, the new numbers from 2024 aren't so exciting. Early voting by mail or in person in 2020 was Joe Biden 69%, Donald Trump 21%. So the 26-point margin that exists today, 61 to 35, back in 2020 was a 48-point margin. This is based on reporting from Quinnipiac University and Pew Research Center. So what seems like a titillating and inspirational and encouraging and reassuring number, wow, 61% of early voters plan to vote for Kamala Harris. Back in 2020, 69% of early voters did vote for Joe Biden. Kamala Harris is doing 8 points worse this year than Biden did in 2020 among early voters. If you believe what early voters are telling pollsters, and if you assume that what they are telling pollsters will mirror what they actually do. Now, I know that there are going to be people that don't like the fact that I'm reporting this. There's a lot of kill the messenger lately. If you look on my subreddit, you see people saying, oh, can't we get a little more optimism from David? All of these negative forecasts and all of this stuff. Folks, this is not a show like some of these overtly Democratic strategist or Democratic Party aligned shows where it's, well, let's calculate how the audience will react based on what we say. And here's what we want them to do. And here's how we encourage them to. No. Okay. I've said clearly, no matter what the polling shows, we all must vote without a doubt. That being said, I'm just going to tell you what I see. And when I see that Kamala Harris is tracking 8 points worse than Biden in 2020 among early voters, that's a concern. Now, let me give you some counterpoints because there are counterpoints. One of the counterpoints is that in 2020, early voting and mail-in voting was disproportionately more preferred by Democratic-leaning voters in the context of a pandemic, where Republicans were more overtly flouting, not flaunting. Look it up. Don't email me about it. Republican voters were more overtly flouting COVID guidelines and were much more likely to vote in person. Whereas in 2024, from what I'm seeing, it seems that there is a slightly less overt partisan split in early voting. It's clear the early voting still is swaying towards Democratic and left-leaning voters, but there are more Republicans seemingly this time around voting early. Trump has even said, hey, vote whenever. It's all rigged, right? Early voting's rigged, mail-in voting's rigged, but do it, okay? Vote however you can. So one could make the case, and I think it's a reasonable case, that although Kamala Harris is not winning the early vote seemingly in 2024 by as much as Biden won it in 2020, part of that is because both Republican and Democratic voters are participating in early voting in 2024 in a way that Republicans did not in 2020. What's the final takeaway? What sounds like a great number may or may not be, but we need to not take any chances and make sure that we are registered and make sure that we have a plan to vote and that we have set aside the time to vote, whether it's voting early in person, voting early by mail, or voting in person on Election Day. This time around, I have voted by mail. I vote early by mail, and that works for me, and I've done it, and it's all fantastic. So that's where we are. Important to go beyond the headlines. Fox News is really depressed. And the reason that many Fox News hosts are depressed is that the stock market is doing really well. Remember that in 2020, Donald Trump predicted that if Joe Biden became president, we would have a 1929 style market crash, depression. It would be terrible. It would be a disaster. And of course, much the opposite happened. It is stock market record after all-time high. Now, Trump is predicting that if Kamala Harris wins, we will have a 1929 style depression. If you always predict a depression is coming, you might eventually be right, but it doesn't really say much for your predictive powers. Well, we had yet another day during which the stock markets touched all-time record highs. And Maria Bartiromo, it's got to be a really tough time for her right now. The stock market doing so well when you've got a Democratic president.
Welcome back. Take a look at the futures this morning. Another rally underway. The Dow Industrial's up 67. The Nasdaq up 43. S&P 500 up 7.25, extending into further record territory. We're looking at last week's rate cut rally continuing. The Dow and the S&P 500 closing in record territory yesterday. So that's where we begin this morning in uncharted territory.
Uncharted territory. That's right. Record highs. Now, she is hedging a little bit. And the way that Maria is raining on the stock market parade a little bit is by now calling it the rate cut rally. And this is a reference to the decision by the Fed, not made by Powell on his own, but made by the 12 Fed directors across the country, some Democrats, some Republicans, the decision to cut the federal funds rate by 50 basis points, 0.5%. And it is absolutely the case that as a general principle, when you cut the federal funds rate, you do encourage investment in the market because the benefit to keeping money in interest-bearing accounts declines. And thus, it is true that historically, cutting the federal funds rate does help the stock market. The problem is that that's been the case for 5 days, or I guess 6 days as of today. And we had something like 50 or 100 new stock market highs under the Biden administration before this rate cut took place. More from Fox News. It's like a funeral over there. Here is a report that we have yet another consecutive day of record highs. And then the camera cuts to Larry Kudlow, poor guy, Donald Trump's former economic advisor. And Kudlow says, Biden is leaving his successor a world of disorder with regular stock market highs, I guess.
Raining, here we go. The third straight record close for the blue chips. The S&P 500 also closing at all-time highs. Tomorrow, the financials did really well. As we were watching over the past several months, we've got former TD Ameritrade CEO Joe Mowgli at a game, how they will do in dropping rates. That'll do it for us. Kudlow's next.
Hello, folks. Welcome to Kudlow. I'm Larry Kudlow. All right, Kamala Harris's tax hikes would kill 800,000 jobs. Donald Trump's tax cuts would create over 1 million jobs. And Senator Mike Crapo, he says most of the Trump tax cuts won't increase the deficit at all.
There you go. Larry Kudlow going immediately to bashing Kamala Harris and saying everything she would do would be terrible, despite the fact that she would be very similar to President Biden, who has presided over a remarkable economy. Meanwhile, I can tell you what's not going well, and it's the stock for the Trump Media and Technology Group. The theme here is down, 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 now down 80%, 80%. From its high back in April, and things not looking good. So the theme here is, if it's good for the country, but not so good for Trump, they aren't happy. For all of their talk of being the patriots, they say the immigration bill would be good for the country, but Trump says it would be bad for him. So they kill it. The stock market highs normally would be so good, but they don't really help Trump's case that everything Democratic is bad, so it must not actually be the case that it's so good. We've seen them play games with the government shutdowns over the last decade. Now, there was one guy on Fox News, I'll give him credit, kind of pointing out the truth, and that guy is Fox News host Neil Cavuto, who says, Trump seems to talk about the stock market one way when the market is up, and another way when the market is down.
It's interesting because Donald Trump, he's taking credit for this and that the markets are anticipating he's going to get back in power. He doesn't say that when we have a down day in the markets, or maybe it's a different poll that's shown something. And I get that, and both sides get that.
Yeah, both sides get it, but both sides don't really do it. And Neil Cavuto is absolutely right. If the stock market is up, Trump will say it's up because they think I'm going to win and I'm so good for the stock market. If the stock market is down, he will say nothing, or he will say it's down because now it's sort of looking like maybe Kamala has a shot, and that's scaring the stock market. All of that is nonsense. All of that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's not based in fact. And what I would encourage you to do, as I've said before, I don't show up here and claim to be the ultimate source of truth. Go and look average stock market returns when you've got a Democratic president, average stock market return when you've got a Republican president. Don't take my word for it. I've looked at the numbers. My rudimentary arithmetic skills tell me that the numbers are much better when Democrats are in the White House. But don't trust me on it, right? That's the difference between this show and many of those right-wing shows who claim to be the ultimate source of truth. My understanding of numbers is stocks do better when there's a Democratic president. Go and fact check me. And then once you figure out the numbers, then you decide whether Trump's claims and Fox News's claims about stocks under Democrats versus Republicans ring true to you. Let me know what you find. info@davidpakman.com. This is super interesting. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have been hit with criminal charges of a kind you don't often see. Let's discuss what's going on. NPR reports Haitian group seeks charges against Trump and Vance over false Springfield, Ohio claims. The leader of a nonprofit, this is NPR, we'll link to the article. The leader of a nonprofit representing the Haitian community invoked a private citizen right to file charges Tuesday against former President Trump and running mate J.D. Vance over the chaos and threats experienced by Springfield, Ohio since Trump first spread false claims about legal immigrants there during a presidential debate. The Haitian Bridge Alliance made the move after inaction by the local prosecutor, said their attorney, Subodh Chandra of the Cleveland-based Chandra law firm. Charges brought by private citizens are rare but not unheard of in Ohio. Examples might be a grocery store charging a customer for a bounced check. State law requires a hearing to take place before the affidavit can move forward. As of Tuesday afternoon, none had been scheduled. What are they charged with? Disrupting public services, making false alarms, telecommunications harassment, aggravated menacing, and complicity. The filing asks the Clark County Municipal Court to affirm there is probable cause and issue arrest warrants against Trump and Vance. So listen, there have been many who have covered this story as they've been indicted and will imminently be arrested. I respect you too much to tell you that that's what's going on here. But this nonetheless could become another thorn in the side of Trump and Vance, requiring them to defend themselves. Do I think that criminal charges are logical here and likely to lead to a conviction based on the facts? I don't. Do I agree with the Haitian community that what Trump and Vance have done has pointedly weaponized global, certainly national, but arguably global hate and harassment against Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, who are indeed there legally? Yes, I do. They clearly have done that. So I'm curious to see whether such a hearing will ultimately be scheduled. There is legal precedent for this, but against a former president and Republican nominee, if I'm completely honest with you, I don't know that I expect this to go too far, but I do sympathize significantly with what they are going through there in Springfield, Ohio, and Donald Trump fixating on something that got a reaction from Kamala Harris during the debate. They're reading the cats, they're reading the dogs, and then generating significant harassment and hatred against that community. So I remain cautiously optimistic this will go somewhere. I believe that the way to rid ourselves of this targeted harassment against groups like Haitian immigrants is to soundly defeat Trump and Vance at the ballot box. I don't think, a citizen's arrest or citizen's charges in Ohio are going to be the way to do it. I don't think Trump ultimately landing in prison for any of the various criminal charges against him is going to be the way to do it. Don't forget that the best way to support the David Pakman Show is by becoming a member, which gives you access to the daily bonus show, the regular show with no commercials. You also get access to our entire archive of every episode dating back a really long time and plenty of other awesome membership perks. Go to joinpakman.com, joinpakman.com. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Suzanne Craig, who's an investigative reporter and author, along with Russ Buettner, of Lucky Loser, How Donald Trump Squandered His Father's Fortune and Created the Illusion of Success. Suzanne, I'm so glad to talk to you about this because there's really so many layers to this story. There's the layer of, if you accept Trump as the successful business person, we would ask the question, do successful business people make good presidents? But I don't even think we're there because there's the question of, is Donald Trump actually a successful business person and or a self-made man? Many people now know that Trump is not a self-made man, that he inherited wealth and his business from his father, Fred. Well, maybe Fred was the self-made guy, but you talk about in the book how government programs, to a great degree, helped Fred build the wealth that Donald ultimately inherited. So can we start with Fred Trump?
Yeah, it's a good place to start. And I think, Fred, his father, had a bit of a leg up. The family had some money. His father died when he was young. It wasn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough money that it allowed him to start building single family homes. And it's sort of an incredible story. Fred was in his teens when his father passed away of the Spanish flu. And the mom there was really driving the bus. She wanted to start a business, and Fred dreamed of being a builder. So he started taking courses at the local Y and to learn the trade and started building these single family homes. And that he was very good at it. And that could have been his trajectory. But he met a time in American history where the government started putting together programs for people coming out of both the Depression and World War II. And Fred got in on those programs, and he expanded very quickly into building large-scale housing projects. You can still see some of them today in New York. Two of the big ones that come to mind are Beach Haven and Shore Haven. But he really made his money through those programs. And those programs were put together at a time, one could argue maybe in a rush. There was a lot of loopholes in them, and Fred made a lot of money exploiting those loopholes. And I think kind of pushing things to the edge, but that's how the family fortune by and large was made.
So Donald Trump has sometimes talked about how he got started with this small loan of $1 million, but that seems like a very incomplete sort of origin story, really, isn't it?
I would say rather than incomplete, it's just wrong. And it's interesting because Russ and I got a hold of a lot of documents from Fred Trump's financial, life, tens of thousands, more than 100,000 pages. And the closest we could come to identifying anything close to $1 million loan was a gift of $1 million he was given in the 1970s by Fred. But Donald, at every turn, there was a succession struggle in the family early on. Fred Trump Sr. has an heir, had an eldest son, a namesake who was supposed to be the heir. And early on, that didn't work out. Fred, his son, I think, was interested in the family business early on, according to friends that we spoke to in high school who knew him. But he had other interests. And Fred, his dad, was sort of having none of that and just saw a weakness there. And I think it ultimately destroyed Fred Jr. He died of alcoholism-related complications in his early 40s. It was quite tragic. But by the time Donald Trump was 18 or 19, that succession battle was over, and Fred Trump had picked his man, and it was Donald.
One of the claims that's been made, and superficially, I ran some numbers and it certainly seems plausible, is that had Donald Trump all along simply thrown his money, his family's money, ultimately his money, into an S&P 500 index fund or a total stock market index fund, just let it ride, reinvest the dividends, et cetera, that actually he'd be wealthier than he is today, bearing in mind we don't exactly know how wealthy he is because there seems to be some doubts about it based on everything we've learned. Is that fair to say? Has he done worse by doing things with the money rather than just letting it ride in the market?
I think Resident, I feel there's no question. He invested in himself, and it was a bad investment compared to just putting his money in the S&P 500, for example. Yes, no question. Yeah.
And can you say anything more about to what degree that's the case, or what is that gap, that mathematical gap that appears there based on your understanding of the amount of money he received and the times at which he received them?
Well, I think he if he just invested in the S&P 500, it would have been more than double what he has, not what he has now, but what he inherited. Not just inherited, but also the money that he got from The Apprentice. We talk about the book, and it's named Lucky Loser for a reason, because Donald Trump has had some incredible strokes of luck in his life. One of them was simply being born the son of Fred Trump, and into an incredibly wealthy family at the time. Fred would have been a billionaire by today's standards. And they lived a very privileged life, and he inherited more than $400 million ultimately when Fred died. And then there was also all the things he got, all the money that he got, sometimes that his other siblings didn't get during his lifetime. And then the second rush of money that he got was from The Apprentice, the TV show. And that one's sort of an interesting one, because I think when people try to get their head around how do you make so much money from a TV show, he made pretty much the equivalent of what he inherited from his father. It was because while he was a host of The Apprentice, and he got a $50,000 fee originally for doing that, he cut an incredibly lucrative deal with Mark Burnett, who was the producer of the show, and he had been coming off of Survivor. And Mark Burnett was starting to understand the power of integration, or product integration money. That's when you have a product on a show, and the company that produces that product, they pay to have their product on the show. And The Apprentice was essentially an hour, 45-minute long commercial for products. A toothpaste company would come on, and they would have the contestants battle to make an ad campaign for them.
Right.
And we learned through financials that we obtained from the show that they were making every episode was making $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, $4 million. Donald Trump was getting half of that. And then in addition to that, he was striking licensing deals off of his celebrity. And he was making another, half of the money about roughly came from product integration, and another 200 some million came from the licensing deals that he struck. So these were the two huge rushes of money that he had in his life, these two fortunes. And what the book shows is that he invested them in businesses, in short, that largely lost money for one reason or another.
Can you talk a little bit about Trump's bankruptcies and specifically address Trump's claim, whenever he's been confronted with this, that his bankruptcies were all just knowing how to use or game the system, much like when he gets called out for donating to Democrats in the past, he says, well, I was playing the game. I knew how you manage it. Similarly, that his bankruptcies were not failures in a business sense, but they were him understanding the law and understanding the benefits of calculated bankruptcy. Is that true?
There's simple things to break that down for his Atlantic City bankruptcies. This is a man who went into Atlantic City and built 3 casinos that were competing against each other. Is there any shock that they went bankrupt? They went bankrupt because of his bad decisions. That's the bottom line for those. When I hear that, I hear he's a master of the tax code, and that's why he has losses. We looked at this, it doesn't, there's some depreciation in the numbers that we saw, and we've seen his taxes for his corporate and personal taxes for, 20 some years, his modern taxes up to 2018. What we saw was actual losses in the businesses, which we had visibility into. There are a few that make money, but for the most part, by and large, they lose money, and they require a lot of money, just capital injections to keep going.
I want to talk a little bit about the tax returns, because you were the reporter to whom Donald Trump's 95 tax returns, I believe, were anonymously mailed during the 2016 presidential election. And if I recall correctly, although sometimes our memory of this stuff gets hazy, the headlines were Trump's tax returns leaked and we're going to learn all this stuff. But then it turned out it was the 95 tax returns. Was it only 95 that was leaked to you?
No. So I'll walk you through that. The first returns that we got were the 1995 tax returns, and those showed cumulative losses of roughly $1 billion. It was a pretty shocking number. We were able to confirm that those were authentic, and we got them to press. But then as we went on, it's like this great thing about the wonder of journalism. You never quite know what you're going to be doing next when you come into the office the next day. We kept writing on his taxes and looking for stories. We kept getting more information. So we kept writing. And in 2017, we started to look into Fred Trump and just the wealth that was inherited. We wanted to break down exactly, who was Fred Trump and what did Donald inherit from that. And as part of that search to get to the bottom of that, we started just by looking at property records in New York City. There's this great system where you can look up the owners of properties. And in part of doing that, we saw some names that were on a lot of the documents. So we started to keep a source list. One of the people that we saw occasionally would appear on it was Mary Trump and her brother Fred III. They all have similar names named after each other. And we realized, and we'd known that Mary Trump had been in litigation with the family over her grandfather's will. She was essentially, her and her brother were essentially cut out. They weren't left very much, and they felt that they should have received a share equal to Donald and his siblings. So they went, and there was a lawsuit that went into litigation, and that's sort of a magic word for reporters. We knew that a lot of information, a lot of financial information had likely been turned over. We didn't know what, but I went to Mary Trump's store and I spoke to her. And initially she wasn't receptive, but eventually we met. And she didn't really know either what was in those documents, but she agreed to go and get them for us. And we took them and we took them to a locked room in the New York Times, and spent about a year going through them. And that story had some tax return information, more about Fred Trump. We had some partnership information. We had his gift tax returns back to the 1940s. But we were able to ascertain through that story, both that Donald Trump inherited, this $400 million plus money, but that it was enhanced through tax fraud. And there we saw something quite fascinating, which was Fred Trump. There's a lot of differences between Fred and Donald. In some ways they're similar, but one of the differences is Fred Trump kept so much cash on hand. And in the early 1990s, he was getting on in age. And the kids realized that if he died, they'd be facing a 50% roughly gift tax on that cash. So they set up this corporation. And what they did is Fred Trump, he bought a lot of stuff for his buildings. You think boilers and paint and, things big and small. And he would go and buy them from wholesalers. Well, one day all of that switched and another company started buying it. It was a company controlled by Donald Trump and his siblings. What they would do is they would buy it. They would sell it to their dad at a markup and pocket the difference. The only purpose of that company was to do that and drain the cash down from Fred Trump so that they could get a hold of it to avoid that higher tax. So that story ran. Yeah. And then eventually we kept digging around. We got another sort of, I guess, a transcript of tax return information from 1985 to 1994, if I'm remembering that correctly. And that showed another decade where he lost just hundreds of millions of dollars, including even the year he wrote Art of the Deal, which was, he's claiming to be this big deal maker and a huge success. And in fact, that year, he's lost tens of millions of dollars on his tax return. And then the final piece of it was we ended up eventually getting his tax return information for a few decades, both personal and corporate, up to 2018. We were able to get that before even the Supreme Court ruled on it and show readers that he doesn't pay a lot of income tax, that he's had huge losses, but also we were able to reveal a lot about, just the magnitude of money that he made from The Apprentice, which is papered over the losses on a lot of his other businesses.
Last thing I want to talk about is more recently Trump's income and businesses. From the outside, it seems as though, number one, Trump has very high fixed costs by nature with the plane and the various homes. And there just seems to be a lot of overhead there, which maybe generates the need for Trump to do things like selling a commemorative coin just 5.5 weeks out from a presidential election, which you know, you don't typically see presidential candidates do. So maybe there's like a high fixed cost and a need for cash there. But then also there's been this reporting that while he was president, he made $1.6 billion, about $400 million a year. What is that income from? Is it rents on buildings he owns, licensing fees for buildings his name's on, but he doesn't own? Like, what is his current income from?
Yeah, and I can't speak necessarily to that number. It may be revenue, but what he has been able to do recently, and I'm not sure it makes up for, we saw coming into him running for president that his licensing deals, not surprisingly, were on the downtick. He was, several years into Celebrity Apprentice. His brand was not as red hot as it was when The Apprentice first took off. And then when he came down the escalator that day to announce that he was running for president, he made disparaging comments about Mexicans, and a lot of the licensing deals just went for the door, and NBC also fired him. And then during the presidency, he definitely was able to profit off of it in certain ways. I use that word carefully because a lot of the ways that he was able to make money, the old post office comes to mind. It's the hotel that he was operating in Washington. People would come and stay there.
Yeah.
Foreign governments would buy rooms. All that did was just sort of mitigate his losses. He lost a lot of money on the old post office. We can see that through his taxes and also from information that has been released on the hotel. And he was also pumping a lot of money into it. But that money that was going in from insiders trying to curry favor definitely curbed his losses. And he also, at Mar-a-Lago, he also raised the price of entrance for people wanting a membership, so that helped. But right now, he's really in an interesting situation. He's no longer a hospitality brand. He's a political brand. I talked to experts during the book writing process about that, and many of them, these hospitality consultants who track brand, they're not following him anymore. He's gone into things like you mentioned, the coins. He's got sneakers going. He's done a Bible. These are licensing deals. And they're bringing in some money. I just don't see them sort of outweighing what he was bringing in. And then he's got True Social. That's tricky. That's the publicly traded company. I don't know what it's trading at today, but if he were to sell whatever interest he has there, it would kill the stock. So that's a tricky situation. And then remember the headwinds that he's facing if he's forced to pay the fines in New York State. And just talk about the New York Attorney General there. He had a judgment against him. The fines are, in the 450 million range. And if that case is upheld on appeal, he's going to have to write a check for that. So there's a lot of headwinds coming in, and we don't know where this is going to end. A lot of it depends if he's elected or if he's not.
Yes, very much seems to be riding on that for sure.
Yeah.
We've been speaking with Suzanne Craig, who alongside Russ Buettner is co-author of Lucky Loser, How Donald Trump Squandered His Father's Fortune and Created the Illusion of Success. Suzanne, so great having you on. Yeah. I really appreciate it.
Dave, this was really great. Thanks for having me on to chat about it. We're excited about the book.
If you value what we do at The David Pakman Show, remember to support us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/David Pakman Show, where you can get access to behind-the-scenes videos, the daily bonus show, the commercial-free daily show. You can support the show for as little as $2 a month. Check it out at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. On the campaign trail yesterday, Donald Trump gave what was billed as an economic speech. Anytime a speech of Trump's is billed as being about policy, you know it's going to go off the rails, and indeed it did. This speech was in Savannah, Georgia, and at a certain point in the speech, Donald Trump wandered around on the stage, hugging the air, pretending to be hugging a chart that he likes. This is not a man who is doing well, and if Joe Biden were to do this, it would be a week of programming on Fox News about cognitive decline and the need to impose the 25th Amendment on him.
History, right? I have a chart that's my all-time favorite. I love that. Is it around? Is it around?
Extraordinarily bizarre behavior.
Love that chart.
And you know what? maybe people are being too hard on Trump. I once became enamored of a PowerPoint presentation I made. And so I get it. This is bizarre, nutty behavior. And Trump couldn't seem to keep his brain clear to even say the most basic things. Trump, despite the fact that he claims he will lower taxes, claimed he delivered the biggest tax increases in history. What?
We did so much. We gave you before the biggest tax hikes in the history of our country and the greatest regulatory cuts in the.
We gave you the biggest tax hikes in the history of our country, and it's Biden who they say is having the cognitive issue. There were glitches, including Trump talking about stopping her country, dystorics, and then moving on.
And we must stop her country dystoric. This is a country.
That throat pop he does when the shoulders glitch, it's, my 2-year-old daughter, she's gotten into doing that. Trump seems to be doing the exact same thing. Moments after this, Trump claims that it's Kamala Harris who has the real cognitive problem, which is wild because there seems to be zero cognitive issue with Kamala Harris.
These people, we have to get back to a country again. We have to be respected. They laugh at us all over the world. They're laughing at us. And you know what they're really laughing at? Kamala, because they can't believe that she's going to be president. They can't believe. You talk about cognitive problems. She's got bigger cognitive problems than he has, in my opinion. This is how we're going to end the era of inflation and mayhem, misery.
I love how Trump drops in a complete non sequitur that is not based in anything. Kamala's got the biggest cognitive problems. And then he goes right back to the teleprompter speech about inflation like that, like it's a completely reasonable transition. It's bizarre. It's jarring. And it doesn't exactly telegraph stability when you think about Trump in high stakes situations. Trump also yesterday went as close to overtly pro-Putin as I have seen him get lately. Usually when it comes to Russian President Vladimir Putin, Trump will kind of tiptoe around the praise. But this is pretty close to just pro-Putin. It's sort of disturbing to hear.
Biden and Kamala got us into this war in Ukraine, and now they can't get us out. They can't get us out. I watched him. We will win. We will. He's been saying that for 3 years. Every time Zelensky comes to the United States, he walks away with $100 billion. I think he's the greatest salesman on earth. But we're stuck in that war unless I'm president. I'll get it done. I'll get it negotiated. I'll get out. We got to get out. Biden says, we will not leave until we win. What happens if they win? That's what they do, is they fight wars. As somebody told me the other day, they beat Hitler, they beat Napoleon. That's what they do. They fight. And it's not pleasant, but, we've given them close to $300 billion.
So if you can unravel the word salad that was there, what Trump is saying is, hey, you know what? Russia participated in defeating Hitler. So Russia can't be that bad, right? And of course, it's a child's understanding of geopolitics, ignoring the kind of uncontroversial reality that global alliances can change over time. Priorities can change over time. The Cold War, Russia's involvement with Afghanistan and North Korea, and global alliances change. But yet Trump's kind of like, I don't know why they say Russia's so bad and Putin's so bad, because Russia was on our side in World War II. And it's very difficult to have substantive conversations with someone who has such an immature view of geopolitics. And it's fine to have an immature view of geopolitics. You just shouldn't be president of the United States. Trump did go back to this whole black jobs and Hispanic jobs thing, really going through all of the different hits.
Out of all the jobs that were created, most of those jobs went to illegal migrants. You know that. It didn't go to Americans. And what's happening with the people pouring into our country is they are killing the jobs of the black population and the Hispanic population. They're taking their jobs. Out of all the jobs.
Yeah. I don't think that this is helping him to convince non-white voters to flock to him on November 5th. We're definitely not seeing any evidence that that's working. Despite economists left and right agreeing that Trump's tariff proposal would be inflationary for the reasons we outlined in more detail at the top of the show, Trump brags about his tariff plan.
And by the way, you know, for years they knocked the word tariff, properly used, is a beautiful word. One of the most beautiful words I've ever heard. It's music to my ears. A lot of bad people didn't like that word, but now they're finding out I was right.
Yeah. Economists agree it's a very, very bad idea. At one point in his cognitive wisdom, Trump insists that his head or brain is like a muscle.
It's not muscle. It's all right there. That's a muscle too, they say.
Yeah. And then in a final disjointed moment, Trump says it's really hard for him to get good sleep because he has so many great ideas in his brain, rattling around in there.
I find it very hard to sleep. I get so many ideas. I'm thinking all the time. This guy just goes out, lies down, goes out, pictures of him. It's pretty sad when you think about it, right? We laugh, but it's sad.
Yeah. Stimulants also famously make it difficult to fall asleep at night. Just a note. So Trump's economic speech, a speech about economic policy, supposedly billed that way, mostly Trump using the same sorts of ad hominems against his political opponents that he's been using for a while. And as far as policy goes, promising only the very tariffs that economists on both sides of the political spectrum insist will cause inflation to the tune of $3,900 a year for the average family. Not inspiring confidence in Trump's economic plan, that's for sure. We have a voicemail number you can call any time of day. Here's a caller upset that my story of meeting Rosario Dawson and John Leguizamo at the White House was on the bonus show. But I want to address this in a little bit of detail because either way I was going to get attacked. Listen to this.
David, I'm listening to the show today, and you said that on the bonus show, you will be telling the story of how you met Rosario Dawson at the White House. On the bonus show, David, you are locking this behind a paywall.
Yeah.
You met Jedi Master Rosario Dawson. You met Becky from Kevin Smith's Clerk franchise, Rosario Dawson. How dare you, David? How dare you deprive us, your loyal audience, of this story by locking it behind a bonus show paywall, David? I am so outraged. I am signing a billion-year contract to pledge to never support you.
Okay, so now it's getting hyperbolic. Listen, there were a bunch of people who wrote in and said, David, it's really unfair for you to put your story of visiting the White House last week for Hispanic Heritage Month on the bonus show. You're paywalling the bonus show. That's really unfair. We don't like that. This is what non-members said. Fair. The counterpoint is, I can assure you that 5 weeks out from a presidential election, if I spent the 20 minutes that we spent on the bonus show talking about my trip to DC on the broadcast podcast, I would get emails from people saying, David, we're 5 weeks out from an election and you spend 20 minutes talking about how Rosario Dawson likes the David Pakman show. What the hell is this? I'm unsubscribing from your public podcast. So either way, I would have gotten crushed by someone. It is on the bonus show last week on Friday's bonus show. I tell the whole story. I'm sorry to everyone that I'm perpetually disappointing. I really am. On today's bonus show, we will talk about Kamala Harris's call to end the Senate filibuster. We will talk about an Arizona Democratic Party office that was shot at. And we will talk about Alex Jones' InfoWars to be auctioned off to pay the settlement for the Sandy Hook families. Are we finally getting to the end of Alex Jones's broadcast career? I fear we are not. and I will explain why. All of those stories on today's bonus show. Sign up at joinpacman.com. Thanks a lot for watching today's show. I just want to take a second to tell you about today's sponsors. The only VPN to prove multiple times in court that they have no record of your internet activity is private internet access. Each time the judge said, show us the person's internet activity, and private internet access said, sorry, we don't have it. Their systems are also regularly audited by Deloitte to verify the no-log policy. And it's the only VPN with open source code, so the whole world can see that nothing is being logged. Private internet access is giving my audience 83% off, which is just $203 a month, plus 4 extra months for free. Go to piavpn.com/DavidP. The link is down below.